be breaking my talk into 3 parts. The first part is going to be, do human rights exist? The second part is going to be how rights change over time. And the third part, which I'm going to spend woefully little time on, is the state of human rights in Canada. This is going to be a bit of a long talk. It's going to be pushing the 15 minutes, so while I really, really do want questions, it would be beneficial if you could save them until the end of the talk. So let's get started. Human rights, do they exist? So obviously they're a concept, so I can't point to human rights on a map. I can't show you where on the human body you would find human rights. But so what do I mean by do they exist? Human rights often are broken down into 2 different categories. Legal rights, which are rights that are given by laws, and natural rights, which are unalienable, universal rights. They're rights that apply to all people, regardless of laws and culture and religion or anything else. They're rights that everyone always absolutely has. So my big question is there really such a thing as natural rights? Are there any rights that are so intrinsically linked with human society that either human society could not exist without them, or they would be a necessary consequence of human society? I feel no. They don't exist. Every single right that we have is a right that we have granted ourselves through laws or culture or through tradition. And the reason I feel this way is that for every right that I can think of, and I think every right that exists, there is at least one society in which some group of people, usually a decently large group of people, have been denied that right. And part of the problem is that inalienable means you can't take them away. And there have been a lot of societies that had slaves, and almost every society, maybe every society, has had prisoners or prisons or some sort of concept like that. So it pretty much precludes everyone having all rights all the time. And the other problem with universal is sometimes people really, really think that they're given universal rights, and they don't quite do it. So I'll give an example right away from the US, because the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights is something that pretty much every Bill of Rights since has taken from. The Canadian Charts of Rights and Freedoms has a lot of word-for-word copies from the Bill of Rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights takes a lot of words directly from the United States Bill of Rights. So in 1786, the U.S. declared independence, and right at the beginning, they found the truths to be self-evident that all men were created equal. So it turns out that's maybe a bit less true. In fact, just next year at the Philadelphia Convention, they were trying to work out how their government was going to actually work. And so they got to the legislative branch, the branch that makes laws, and they decided to break it into 2 parts. There's the Senate, which has equal representation. Every state has 2 senators. And then there is the House, which has the number of people that you have in a state roughly equal the number of representatives you have. And so the problem they got to is U.S. maybe had some slaves, maybe a lot of slaves, and while slaves weren't going to vote, because why would slaves get the right to vote, the problem was that the United States government still needed to provide services to everyone, including slaves. So they ran into a problem. The northern states, who didn't have any slaves or had very few slaves, felt that only free blacks should count as people. Whereas the southern states, having lots of slaves and wanting lots of votes and wanting lots of subsidies, felt, slaves really were people in so much as they were still slaves. So they should count as people in one very small respect. So there was a big debate about this, and they actually tried several times to work through this problem, and eventually they came to a compromise called the 3/5 compromise, in which a slave is worth 3/5 of a person as it comes to representation or taxation and stuff like that. So just a year after they said all men are created equal, they said, wait, actually, except for some people, we're going to do some fractions here, but we think we can get the math exactly right. So to get down to specific natural rights that people often talk about, the 3 most common you hear about are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They're in the Declaration of Independence. They're in the Declaration of Human Rights made by the UN, and I think they are in no way natural rights. Because, first of all, life. A number of societies, let's say the Aztecs, had human sacrifices. People didn't really choose to be sacrificed often. So those people were being denied their right to life. Likewise, lots of places execute prisoners. So again, people don't have an absolute right to life. It clearly can be taken away from them, which means it's not inalienable and it's not natural. In terms of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, to pick a very recent example of things still going on, the US has the concept of life in prison with no chance of parole. In fact, the US has put people in prison for life who weren't even the 18 yet. So we've taken people and put them in prison for their entire adult life. Clearly, those people don't have liberty, and they don't really have an opportunity to pursue happiness. So those aren't inalienable rights. In terms of other things that we often think of as rights that everyone obviously has, freedom of speech, obviously awesome. Unfortunately, even the country we come from, UK, doesn't have it. So it's not an inalienable right. And that even gets more difficult because we have the concept of free speech, but there are restrictions to it. I can't slander someone, so there is some sort of restriction on my rights to free speech. And let me just say, I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying absolute rights are recommended. I'm just saying it means that they can't be considered inalienable rights. Likewise, the right to a fair trial and not to be detained without cause is something that we often like to think about, something that absolutely everyone has. It's an intrinsic quality of humanity that people should have these things. But, there are lots of people who go to prison and have no trial whatsoever, like, let's say, anyone in Guantanamo Bay right now. And there are lots of people who have had trials, but, a Stalinist show trial isn't really a trial at all. So I don't think that a fair trial and the right not to just be imprisoned indefinitely is an intrinsic human right that we have. It is something that we have to earn for ourselves. Finally, the other one that we usually like to think about as obviously a right everyone has, the right to not be tortured. The problem with thinking of that as a natural right is there was a very long period of time in which almost everyone constantly expected and feared the Spanish Inquisition. It was a real fact of life. Even now, to pick on the US because they like to think of themselves as a bastion of rights, they torture people. They waterboarded people. They keep people in solitary confinement for indefinite periods of time. Those are torture. We torture people, therefore the right to not be tortured is not inalienable. So I know someone out there is thinking, well, you've forgotten this right that totally everyone has. You may be right. Tell me about it after the talk, at the question period, and you can prove me wrong and I'll look dumb. But moving on. So there are certain groups of people that often bear the brunt of not getting rights. There are a lot of people who tend to be routinely denied rights. For instance, outsiders, people who aren't part of a country or a society often don't have the same rights as those inside the society. For instance, I don't have Canadian citizenship. I can't vote, even though voting is a right in Canada. In terms of other groups that tend to get denied, people with mental health issues. For instance, in the US, 39 states have laws that restrict or prevent people with mental health issues from voting. Prisoners routinely have rights removed from them, sort of by definition, in the same way that slaves often have their rights taken away from them, because that's roughly how we would even define those two things. Another group that always seems to get the brunt of things is minorities, whether it's racial, cultural, or religious minorities. For instance, in the US, even once blacks technically had the right to vote, a number of southern states didn't really feel like that was a good idea. So they put in place literacy tests. And the idea was that if you weren't literate, you shouldn't be able to vote because you can't understand the issues. But in practice, what they did is they made an impossible test that they were only giving to people that they didn't want to vote. So the way the test would be formatted, I've looked at a test that Arizona used to give, or Arkansas, one of the two. It was a state. And the way the test worked is you had 10 minutes and there were 30 written questions, and if you gave any wrong answer, you couldn't vote. Now, it was a literacy test, so I figured that, I could read and write, I could probably pass it, and I had my mom and dad do it because my dad's got a PhD and my mom literally is a copy editor for a living. So they're pretty experienced with this whole reading writing thing. All of us got at least 3 questions wrong, because it was impossibly hard. All the questions would be designed so that they would be either mental tricks. There were a couple optical illusion questions. To give an example, if anyone's ever seen the triangle of text where you're supposed to write out what's inside it, and it says Paris in the spring, but it actually says the because it skips lines. So it would be tricks like that to stop people from voting. Or there would be questions that would be completely ambiguous. So no matter which way you answered them, someone could argue, and no doubt would argue, that you answered it incorrectly. In terms of other groups that often are less fortunate in terms of rights, lower class individuals, obviously in any very caste-based society, like let's say India, people who are in the lower caste don't have nearly the same rights as people in the upper castes. Minors, we think it's perfectly fine for someone who is less than the age of 18 or 21 or any arbitrary age to not have the same rights. And I think to an extent that's reasonable, because we can't expect everyone to, at a young age, to be qualified to be able to exercise their rights. But you get into interesting issues, like young people can't vote, even though the laws that are created will affect them more than anyone else, because not only will the laws exist throughout their whole lives, but they'll actually live to see the long-term consequences. On the other hand, elderly people, they are the strongest voting bloc. They are often pandered to. They are not going to see the long-term consequences of things like taking money from Social Security. So we've created a system where the people who are most affected by laws also have the least say in influencing them. And finally, the biggest group that is routinely screwed over in terms of laws is women. Somehow we found it all right that, maybe half the population should get half the rights at most. And it's tragic. I worked out the other day that, in fact, the US will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I before they'll celebrate the 100th anniversary of women being able to vote. And that's frightening and sad. So when we talk about rights, we often think of them as a progression of increasing rights. Like, now we have democracy. We don't have kings anymore or queens anymore. Technically, we have a queen, but she doesn't do anything, whatever. And women have rights, and women have increasing rights. They got voting rights, and they have reproductive rights. Someday they'll be able to not be harassed on the street. That will be a right. They'll actually be granted. And we have same-sex marriage now, so we're doing all right, and things are getting better all the time. And awesome. And in many ways they are, but laws don't, rights don't just increase over time. There are also rights that we lose. For instance, historically, if you look, Prohibition, the US had the right to drink, lost the right to drink, and then gained it again. Likewise with marijuana, until the early 1900s, marijuana was completely legal. In fact, when a group of people wanted to get rid of marijuana, they changed the spelling of marijuana so the H became a J, so it would look more like Tijuana, because lots of people didn't like Mexicans, and they figured, this is the truth. Lots of people didn't like Mexicans, and if they made marijuana look more like a Mexican thing, then it would be easier to ban it. And, in the US and in Canada and elsewhere, we're starting to see pushback on those kinds of things, but those are rights that we once had and don't have anymore. In terms of rights that exist now but are going away, when the US Constitution was made, the right to bear arms was seemingly an obvious right. Everyone thought they needed the right to have guns to protect themselves from tyranny. But in the last 100 years or so, as new constitutions have been made, very few countries have enshrined that right. In fact, generally, if a country references guns in their constitution in the last 100 years, it is specifically to add restrictions to gun ownership. And then in terms of rights that exist now but won't exist in the future, right now we've been seeing that privacy is changing. The Edward Snowden leaks have suggested that essentially, in many ways, none of us really have any privacy. And the way technology is improving, I don't know if there's actually a chance for us to ever gain these rights back. It may be impossible for us to have privacy the way we did before. So finally, I'm just going to very briefly talk about human rights in Canada. Obviously, there are lots of human rights issues, and I'm going to mention 5 of them. But first and foremost, by show of hands, who has heard of the notwithstanding clause? For those of you who have not heard of it, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have an article, I think it's Article 32, but regardless, we have an article that says you can make a law that ignores anything else in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as long as you say, notwithstanding this right that everyone believes should be universally true, I'm going to make a law to restrict it. For instance, France has some language laws in terms of signage that, in spite of freedom of speech, signs have to be in French. Quebec. What did I say? I wouldn't be surprised, but that's unrelated. Thank you very much. So the only restriction with the notwithstanding clause is every 5 years you have to reaffirm the law, because I'm sure no one can think of any example in which over a 5-year period of time, the majority would anyway want to subjugate a minority of people and violate their rights. So in terms of other issues that are going on right now, there is a muzzling of scientists, specifically climate scientists in Canada. It's a real freedom of speech issue. It seems that we've decided that the money we get from the tar sands is more important than an honest discussion about the potential problems of the tar sands and other issues. Beyond that, there have been some really major collective bargaining issues in Canada in the last couple of years, and I don't think there's been a lot of talk on them. In the last 3 years, both Canada Post and Air Canada have been forced back to work. They have been stripped of their rights to strike, and that's a real big issue. A couple other things quickly. Drug policy, because it's sort of in the news again, because Trudeau has said that he smoked marijuana before. Shock, surprise. And finally, something that isn't being talked in Canada about in Canada, I think is really important, is the right to die. I have trouble thinking of people having rights and not having the right to choose whether or not they want to continue living. Hasn't really been talked about a lot in Canada. There's been a very interesting case in Britain that's happened recently. It was the Tony Nicholson case, if anyone wants to look it up. Basically, Tony Nicholson was a man with locked-in syndrome. He had full-body paralysis, and he petitioned the government for the right to die and was not granted it. I recommend reading up on it. It's very interesting. So I talked about a bunch of things, and in terms of what I actually want you to remember from this talk is there isn't some list of universal rights that we can just grant and be done with, and I think that's a good thing, because every right that we have is one we fought for and earned, and any right we want is one we can attain, because it's no less, there aren't any other rights that are more special than it. Any right is a right we could have. Another thing that I think is important is the idea that just because a right was important in the past doesn't mean it's important now. We shouldn't get bogged down by tradition and restrict ourselves based on what's happened in the past. And finally, while Canada's a great place, human rights issues are happening here, and it's important that we actually make a big deal about it and say something, because we directly influence what happens in Canada. Questions and stuff? Yep.
I think you pointed out the main problem, or the common thing I hear throughout everything you point out, was that it's like the government restricting freedoms on people.
Okay.
Would you agree with that? Is that that's what it sounds like as the common thing, like the government's either granting or taking away granting?
I would probably be a bit weaselier and say society instead of the government. In practice, government is almost always the driving force in laws, although in the past the church has been although the church was essentially acting as a government. Yes, in practice, I would say that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, because, for example, I mean, the majority of Canadians want marijuana legalized, but yet it hasn't happened, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like the government and the will of the people are always in line with each other.
I would agree with that, and that's why it's important for us to take a stand, because we should be able to define what happens in the country, in so much as we're not, as a majority, doing horrible human rights violation stuff. We should not do that ever. Jim.
So it seems like in your talk that you didn't make a distinction between contravening a right that somebody has and that person not having the right at all. Is there really a distinction to be made there, or is that?
I think there potentially is. I feel that if a right is systematically being taken away by a group of people, that is equivalent to not having that right. But I think
the distinction, was that a difference?
Yeah, and obviously, I could murder someone. That doesn't mean murder's all right. I just people can take actions that are in contrast to what the laws and rights are, but in a more aggregate sense, if it's happening systematically to a large amount of people, it's equivalent to that right not existing, in my mind. Obviously subjective.
Do rights exist? Is there any right that exists?
Not outside of what we create. They are a concept that we apply to things. I think rights are a kind of law, essentially. And so they don't exist in nature. They don't exist without us. They're something that we define and impose on ourselves.
I might disagree with that, actually.
Interesting.
I think there is a right that is, there's this concept of positive versus negative rights. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Yeah.
So a negative right is something that you can just do. I have the right to do this because I can. I have the right to open my mouth and talk because I can. Whereas a negative right would be something that relies on someone else. Like if I have the right to welfare, that relies on the government taking money from one person and giving it to me, right? It's not something I'm doing. So I'd say that there are some rights that actually exist, even though there are still concepts, which would be my ability to do them, like the right to walk down the street, for example.
There, I think we get really into semantics because obviously someone could imprison you specifically so you couldn't do that. I will say I find it useful to make a distinction between like the sort of holy rights that we think, and holy is a good word to use here, great, that we think of like the rights to life that absolutely can be taken away in my mind, but I will grant you that I can't really, in practice, I can't really stop you from doing a bunch of your positive rights.
I just have an opinion. I'm curious whether or not you agree. I kind of always felt like the biggest enemy of human rights is apathy, because I think most people, no matter where they're from, sort of want best for everybody, but often the largest population is very apathetic to enforce. I don't know, what do you think?
I would definitely agree with that, and I think part of the problem is diffusion of responsibility, because there's a lot of general concepts we like, but a lot of people they apply to, we don't really think about actually doing things to do them. It's only really when our rights really are specifically and personally being attacked that we tend to take action, and it's terrible, and I do it. Yes?
Hi. I think often in our discourse about rights, there seems to be missing any discourse about the idea of obligations. Do you think that the idea of rights should be measured by a thought of what should we be obligated to do? For example, in the context of democracy and citizenship, we're not obligated to vote, though in Australia I think they are.
Yeah.
Should we be talking sometimes more about obligations that come with rights that we have, or do you think it's okay to have just rights without it imposing?
No, I think obligations is absolutely important. I didn't really focus too much on it. I had limited time. I haven't really done nearly as much thinking about obligations, but I would agree that they're at least as important and go right along with and are in some ways equivalent to rights.
I have two questions.
Sure.
How do you feel about human rights commissions, and how do you feel about the removal of Section 13?
Let's start with the second one. What is Section 13?
They removed hate speech from the community. I forget what the act is called.
Okay,
Human
yeah.
Rights Act.
Mixed feelings. I feel like a hate crime is a kind of crime. I'm not sure yet whether I think it is a worse kind of crime. Maybe, but I don't know if I've thought a bit about it, but I haven't come to a definite answer just because I'm not sure if we can properly enough define hate speech and hate speech laws such that they're effective. Obviously, I don't like hate speech. Or hate crimes in general. I guess if I had to pick, I would say I'm probably against us removing that. Unless someone could convince me that there was a good reason to remove it or there was a good reason it shouldn't be there, I don't see why we would take the effort to remove it. What was your first question?
How do you feel about human rights commission? The Canadian Human Rights Commission and provincial?
I think they can have the ability to do very important things and can be an important part of society. I don't know enough about in practice whether they are successful in that goal or if they are just needless bureaucracy. So I don't know. In theory, they seem like a good thing. In the back?
Like, I was saying that, like, you know, like opening your mouth and like moving your hands around, that's like a right, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it also be right, you know, if there's like someone, I don't like the way he looks in the street, like going to the baseball bat and trying to hit him? I mean,
arguably, yes. I actually was going to have a section in this where I was going to talk about marriage and how, maybe gay marriage made marriage, like same-sex marriage made marriage universal, but I can't marry multiple people, and I think by all rights people should be able to. But then you get into, should I be able to get into an incestuous marriage? Should I be able to marry someone against their will? There are a number of countries in which I could marry an 8-year-old. And that may be a right. I feel uncomfortable saying it's a right. I certainly don't think it's something it's something I would want to have happen. I don't know if I feel that rights should only be positive things, but I would say arguably it's a right. It's just a right I don't think we should have.
There's a phrase, Brennan, the right to swing my arm ends at your nose.
Yes. Semantics issue, I would say at point. Important semantics issue, because semantics issues are important. Gary?
So speaking of semantics.
Awesome.
Have you found many places which, because I noticed you didn't do so in your talk, which actively define what they mean by rights? Because you use the term a lot, and there apparently is a whole bunch of different definitions and terms and subtleties and the active or negative rights and so on. Whereas in most cases here, it sounds like you're primarily talking simply about abilities or inabilities and wherein lies the difference in terms of the various legal frameworks.
I imagine if I had delved into a bit more into legal frameworks, I would have found more rigorous definitions of rights, but I imagine that they do vary a fair bit across different, certainly across different cultures, and then even across countries and provinces within the same culture.
So given that you were talking primarily about US and Canada, what then was the main definition or approximate definition that you were using throughout most of your talk?
Oh, very, very well done, sir. I will admit I thought of them in sort of a fuzzy general sense of obligations, ability. I didn't think in terms of obligations, but it was a good idea. But like things people are able to do and shouldn't, and things that that others shouldn't be able to restrict people from being able to do. I realize that's not a good definition. You've called me out on this, and my bluff has been found.
I'm also wondering about the definition. I think you defined rights as not something that we're born with, not something that is inherent to every person, but it's rules based on wherever we happen to be right now in society.
Yes.
Right. So how does this affect the way we think about right, how we develop right? I think we all want to establish good rules to protect us.
I like the idea of everyone just by being a person having rights. I like the idea of natural rights, even though I don't think they exist. I think what it comes down to for me is while I don't think rights are something people are born with, I think they're the kind of things I want people to have in the society I want to live in. Is that close enough to an answer? Awesome. Jim?
So just real quick, the Life, the Universe, and Everything Else podcast that's produced by the Winnipeg Skeptics and the Humanists, Atheists, and Agnostics of Manitoba did discuss hate crime legislation in Canada on one of our episodes. So if people are interested, they can look into that. I was curious, getting back to what Scott was mentioning about positive and negative rights. Can somebody have a right to do something that they're physically not capable of doing? Can I have the right to do something that's impossible? Now you may say yes or no, but then you should keep in mind that the things that we are able to do change over the course of our lives as well. So if I have the right to free speech, but then somebody disables my ability to communicate in any way, do I still have that right even though I can't? And if so, could I have rights of things that could I have rights to do things that nobody could ever do?
To answer your first question glibly, yes. I think there's a difference between having a right and having the ability to exercise that right. To not go to like physically unable, but I have never been in any sort of court case. I have not been able to exercise my right to non-incrimination. So I don't think that right doesn't exist just for me just because I haven't used it yet. I think that in terms of a right someone could have that, but no one could exercise.
Well, I think that sort of speaks to the idea of natural rights not really existing. Because if suddenly we became post-human and we had the ability to fly or any number of other things, would we somehow instantly gain more natural rights that we didn't previously have?
No, and actually I think I might have a good example for how that works. Property rights in the past, you in some places had the property rights all the way from the bottom of the ground to the top of the sky. But then we invented airplanes, and it did really seem convenient if people could fly places, since that was a thing we could do now. And so what happened is, through courts, it was decided that your rights did not, your property rights did not go all the way up into space. So I think there has to be an external action to enable those rights. Although it also gets difficult because there are some things where there are rights that we may have that aren't enshrined by law but are just enshrined by culture, and if something were to suddenly change, it might so happen that all of us viewed the situation the same way, so we all immediately sort of granted ourselves those rights.
From some of what you're saying, it sounds like you believe that there should be certain rights that are universal.
I feel that there are some rights that every person should have.
Okay, so the second part of my question is, who do you think should be enforcing that? Who's going to ensure across the globe that those rights are consistently maintained?
I think it is impossible to actually, in practice, do that. I think the UN is a nice idea, and I think more specifically, smaller groups that are closer to the problem are probably best for dealing with it. Governments, like local governments, even down to municipal governments, should in practice be the most able to grant rights to people in those locations. The problem with the UN, for instance, is it's a very large group with a lot of very diverse people in it, so it's going to be harder to find people who agree on things. I think that it's an impossible problem, but it's a problem we have to try for, and everyone needs to push for their governments to do things, and potentially for their governments or other organizations to do places even where they don't have jurisdiction, because sometimes human rights are, granting people human rights is more important than any other law or agreement that's in place.
Take one more question.
Eric?
Okay. It seems to me like there is a distinction in many governments between rights that people have the ability to, or people have the right to do something, but they may not have the ability. And then there are rights for which the government must provide the ability to exercise.
Would the second one an example be providing health care for people? Is that what kind of thing you're thinking about? Or
No, something like when people have the right to vote, voting areas must be accessible to people who use wheelchairs, for example.
Okay.
But there are obviously some rights where that doesn't apply. For instance, the government doesn't necessarily have to provide a way for people to express themselves when they're in a coma, for instance. But they have proxy rights.
I would say in terms of things where the government has to take actions, one way to view it might be that the government has forced upon themselves obligations to people. Since I feel rights are artificial things, I'm perfectly fine with the idea that we have different kinds of rights and they just work however we define them. So it just really comes down to how they've codified rights. And also, there you get into the problem for, let's say, someone being in a coma. It may not be possible for the government to do anything, so practicality has to be a concern as well. Okie dokie.